I was asked to speak to the title, How to Fix British Democracy. It's a big question. I think I have about 25 minutes. Like many people, I think I assume that the how-to question, my instinct is that it must be a what question. That is, we're being asked what the fix is, what electoral reform, what constitutional reform, what institutional change, what adjustment to the rules of the game would make it work better, would rectify. I think we all recognize the manifold unfairnesses, injustices, inefficiencies in British democracy, particularly at the moment as it grinds its way through a whole series of crises. And yet, actually, I think that the how question is the real one, not the what question, for the simple reason that if we knew the answer, if we could agree among ourselves, and maybe we could, what to do, if we came up with the ideal solution, the reform that we thought would obviously rectify the injustices and inefficiencies, we still wouldn't answer the really difficult question, which is how would it be adopted? How would we get a system that is not working to reform itself? And that seems to me to be the absolutely central puzzle, not just of British democracy, but of democracy, which is how do democratic systems reform themselves? Because they can't be reformed from the outside. To reform them from the outside would at some level be undemocratic. And I think history teaches us that institutional reform, deep structural institutional reform, is the hardest thing of all for democracies to do. And democracies are littered with the evidence of that. The Electoral College in the United States stands unreformed, and I suspect is going to remain unreformed despite the fact that its injustices are manifest. It's possible, I suppose, just about possible, that Joe Biden will finally decide to take it on, but it seems to me incredibly unlikely because he has better things to do. The House of Lords seems to me to be evidence of the fact that institutional structural reform is incredibly difficult, particularly for long-standing, stable democracies. And part of the problem is not just time. I think part of the problem is the other side of the democratic equation. We're used at the moment to worrying about the question of losers' consent. That is the fundamental democratic test, which is, do the people who lose democratic contests have a reason to stay in the game? And that is being put under pressure. It's put under pressure by events like the Brexit referendum. It was put under pressure, I think, in the United States too, by Trump's presidency. But there is also the issue of winners' consent when it comes to structural institutional reform. And again, forgive me if this sounds obvious, but there is a basic challenge in democratic systems that the people who have to reform the system are the people who have just won under the terms of the system. And for that very reason, they are less well incentivized than the losers, but they have more power. And it's not an insuperable problem by any means, because if it was, winners' consent would mean that nothing ever changed. And things do change, and democratic politics does reform itself. But it's very rare to get the setup right, to get the result of an election which creates the right set of incentives. And I think recent British history is evidence of that. British democracy is, among many other things, I think one word for it, fundamentally unreformed over the last generation or more. I mean, there have been changes, of course there have, devolution and many others, but relatively speaking, in an extraordinarily fast-changing world, our democratic systems look to me as though they contain too many relics of the past. And yet probably the two most propitious moments for structural reform in the past generation of British politics were undone, on the one hand, in 1997, when I think Tony Blair was potentially quite serious about structural and indeed electoral reform. But as he says in his memoirs, the problem is he won by too much. His majority was too big. You might think that would give him the license to do whatever he liked. But as he said, he couldn't sell to a Labour Party that had just won a 179-seat majority in the House of Commons a change to the system. They would have thought he was mad. He needed to win by far fewer. And then he could have done a deal with the Liberal Democrats. Or 2010, the other propitious moment, I think, for structural reform to British politics, where the result was too close. the election where nobody effectively won, and where there had to be a coalition, but then coalition politics produced the kind of horse trading and negotiation where the reforms that came out of it were too fragile to parliamentary and partisan arithmetic and game playing. So yes, we got an AV referendum, but I'm one of those people who believe that George Osborne had set that whole thing up because he knew how it was going to play out. And the one reform we did get, the substantive reform, which shows the huge advantage that British democracy has over American democracy when it comes to structural reform, which is we don't have a codified constitution, so Parliament can do whatever the hell it likes, which was the Fixed Term Parliament Act, the one really big change, which was itself clearly a consequence of narrow, contingent, partisan argument. And what the British Parliament can do, the British Parliament can undo. And the one big reform, I personally think it wasn't a particularly successful one, but the one big reform is about to be undone. So it's hard, I think, no matter what we think should be done, to work out how it would be done. And then I think there's a bigger problem with the terms of the question. I'm not just going to spend 25 minutes telling you that I've been set the wrong question. I'm going to try and offer some answers as well. But the other big problem with the terms of the question, I think, is the idea that democracy is something that can be fixed. Because under the conditions where it needs fixing, that is like contemporary British democracy, where it is divided and fractious and often stuck, literally stuck, as we've seen in recent years, in an institutional setup that seems unable to deal with the problems that it faces. Any fix, any proposed fix, looks like a fix in the pejorative sense. That is, it looks like it's engineered to produce a particular kind of outcome, that we try and fix democracy by, as it would seem to the people who don't like it, engineering a particular kind of result. And I think we had a really stark example of that during the 2017-19 Parliament, where British politics did get stuck. British democracy got stuck. That Parliament, which was created by an election that was called by Theresa May to use the first past the post system to create a kind of mandate for decisive action, and produce the exact opposite, the ultimate nightmare Parliament, at least for the government, where nothing could be done because there was a coalition of people who would veto anything. And during the sort of worst of the impasse, where serious suggestions were made by parliamentarians for something to break the deadlock, a second referendum, for instance, or the group of parliamentarians who canvassed for a citizens' assembly, the idea that this might be the moment to think seriously and substantively about some kind of constitutional convention that will at least address the structural issues. The problem was a parliament that could have agreed on the terms of a second referendum or a citizens' assembly wouldn't have needed one. The reason I was always skeptical there would ever be a second referendum was that I didn't believe that a parliament that could agree on the terms, that is, the question, the franchise, the timing, would have needed a second referendum, because that parliament would also have been able to agree on Brexit. And a parliament that could not agree on Brexit also could not agree on the terms of a second referendum or of a citizens' assembly, or indeed of anything. And we discovered that in the end, the only thing that broke the impasse was, unfortunately, an old-fashioned first past the post general election that produced a skewed but decisive majority. But in case this sounds like a kind of counsel of despair, I'm not saying so therefore you can't fix British democracy, but I think you have to think about the question differently. And I felt this for a while, that there is a tendency when we look at the struggles of established democratic politics around the world to think that there must be a solution. And I don't think that this kind of democratic impasse can be solved in that sense. The other way to think about it is what we need is not a fix, but experiments. We should try new things. We should be willing to suggest and maybe even push for or embrace changes to the way we do democracy, not because we think it will fix democracy, but because we don't know what it would do. Because actually reform, when it's genuinely democratic, will be open-ended. So it's not a fix in the sense that it's designed to engineer a solution, a resolution, particularly of a short-term problem. And even Brexit, relatively speaking, certainly in the last parliament, was a short-term problem, but something which is open-ended. And therefore, in the spirit of democratic politics, because in a way, the point of democratic politics is that it's meant to be surprising. Indeed, that's one definition of it. In a way, you could say fixing politics is much easier for authoritarian regimes, particularly if it's an institutional or constitutional fix, because they just do it. It ought to be really hard for democratic systems precisely because you can't engineer an outcome. And I think that there are lots of ways to think about reform as experiment rather than fix. So for instance, I'm one of those people who is quite keen on the idea that British democracy should make much more use of deliberative forms of democracy. That is, citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies, different ways of both approaching questions, framing questions, discussing questions, and possibly even deciding on questions. The challenge always with selling citizens' assemblies is that there's such an emphasis on getting it right. It would be such a disaster if you sort of set it up and it didn't work. It ended up more fractious, people didn't agree, it broke down. So you have to really engineer it. And in the literature on deliberative democracy, there's a huge emphasis on a kind of whole series of technical setups to make it right. And you need all these experts brought in, you need kind of professional deliberators to come and set it up right, make sure it's properly representative, get the right balance of people, and then moderate the conversations, use experts in the right. The whole thing feels over-engineered. And because it's over-engineered, it's actually deeply unpersuasive as a fix. The alternative would just be to do some and see what happens, in the spirit that it might not work. And if it doesn't work, it's not a disaster. There is some odd balance of risk perspective around democratic politics, which I've struggled with for a while. And indeed, my book, How Democracy Ends, is partly about this, which is, the current fear that democracy is on the edge of some precipice. And if we tinker with it, it's going to collapse. That, over the past few years, we've been at risk of falling back into the 1930s, into fascism, into authoritarianism. I don't believe that. I've never believed that. I think that we're such different societies. We have such different outlooks. We have such different experiences that the risks have been overplayed. But because the risks have been overplayed, the fear of experimentation is high, that somehow tinkering feels like it might undo the whole thing. I don't think it will. I don't think it would. The most substantive democratic reforms historically, to me, have been enfranchisements. So the evolution of democracy, particularly in the long-standing democratic nations like Britain and the United States, has been, at its periods of impasse, often resolved by enfranchising new parts of the electorate. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, the poor, the unpropertied, women, the great enfranchisements. I don't think the great enfranchisements were fixes. In some sense, they were experiments. I mean, they weren't experiments in the sense that I think once you've enfranchised people, it's pretty hard to unenfranchise them. But on the other hand, if you look at the arguments that surrounded, say, the enfranchisement of women, I mean, with hindsight, a lot of them look enormously overblown. But there was a sense that anything could happen. Actually, it was overblown because enfranchisements on the whole don't change that much. They just substantively make democracy, broadly speaking, more just, but they're not a fix. And I want to offer a kind of analogy in the contemporary setting, because I've thought about this a lot, and there's a lot of historical evidence that when democratic politics gets into a rut, the way to move it forward is not some kind of technical structural fix, but just to give more people the vote. Find people who haven't got the vote and give it to them. Doesn't matter, in a sense, what the system is. It breathes new life into it. And the challenge for us, relatively speaking, is that we've enfranchised most people. So it's harder to find the people to enfranchise. But I've been struck for a while now that there is a group of people who are unenfranchised for whom there is an argument for enfranchisement, and that's children. But the enfranchisement of children seems to many people, and I've tried this out on different audiences, to be a laughable idea. I mean, it's either greeted, in my experience, with derision, or, I mean, let's say lowering the voting age to 6. Or if you're in school, you get a vote. I can see people, I'm looking at people smiling as I speak. So 6-year-olds, it's not, people think I'm saying only 6-year-olds should vote. I'm not. I'm saying from 6 up to 106 and beyond. The 6-year-olds would be a very, very small. But say the vote came with full-time education, so from whatever age, and our children probably go to school too early in this country, so let's call it 6. It's thought to be a shocking, not just radical, but sort of a form of vandalism. Whereas, you know, there's a lot of momentum around across the board lowering the voting age to 16. I mean, that seems like a serious, you know, a relative small number of people to enfranchise, but a relative enfranchisement. And I think there's a lot to be said for lowering the voting age to 16, but lowering the voting age to 16 is often presented as a kind of fix. You know, there's something that needs fixing, and it often comes across as a kind of fix. It is often seen as a form of gerrymandering, partly because there is a lot of evidence that age is one of the key determinants of how people vote. And 16 and 17-year-olds, we have a pretty good idea. So for instance, one of the reasons I think there was never going to be a second Brexit referendum is that there would never have been agreement as to whether 16 and 17-year-olds should vote, because we know enough about the likely way they would vote for the people who wanted Brexit to happen, to resist it, and the people who wanted Brexit to be stopped, to embrace it. For me, one of the arguments for, though I'm aware it seems like an outlandish idea, for enfranchising children rather than just 16 and 17-year-olds is I don't think we have any idea how 6-year-olds would vote. I think it would be very interesting to find out. They might vote. People, when I say this, people say, oh, we know what would happen. They would do what their parents say. Would they? Do 6-year-olds do what their parents say? They might do what their grandparents say. They might do what their teachers say. They might decide not to vote. Who knows? Or they might seriously read the manifestos and make a judgment on the basis of what they think would be the best set of policies for the country, you know, unlike adults. Who knows? It would be an experiment. Now, when I say that, people think it would be insane to experiment with democracy with something as radical and drastic. Would it? Would that be more insane than plowing on with a system that seems stuck in the mud? The fact that we don't know what would happen doesn't mean that we can't be reasonably confident that nothing terrible would happen. I don't think anything terrible would happen if children would vote, any more than all of the hysterical, overblown arguments that said when women would vote, or poor people were allowed to vote, or Catholics were allowed to vote, that the country would fall apart. The point about representative democracy is it has all of these safeguards built in. That's how it's meant to work. You know, voting doesn't change that much, but it does, at least if you embrace experimental radical reform, at least open politics up to new voices, ideas, ways of doing things. I happen to think that if children were allowed to vote, we would see a change in our politics, and probably on the whole for the better. It's not going to happen. I'm fully aware that children are not probably going to be given the vote in my lifetime. I make this argument partly just to say, I don't understand why, rather than a technical fix, an open-ended experiment that is, you know, something that we don't know what it would do is thought to be so shocking. And this is partly because, after all, we live in a world where almost everything apart from democratic politics is insanely experimental, in the sense that the world of Amazon and Facebook, and then all whatever, what are we on? We're on Zoom now, are we? So we're probably being experimented on as we speak. Every time we log on, we are taking part in a series, unawares to ourselves, often a series of quote unquote pseudo-democratic experiments about preferences and outcomes and, you know, cognitive biases and all the rest of it. And I am aware that there is a case for representative democracy, the kind of, you know, historically grounded democracy that we have in this country, that it's meant to be a bulwark against that. You know, you wouldn't want our democracy to operate like Facebook does, where 20 times a day you tinker with the system unbeknownst to the people who are participants in the system to try and see if you can make it work better. But it is also true that representative democracy has to compete with Facebook. Representative democracy has to compete. It has to hold our loyalty. It has to command legitimacy in a world where, though a lot of that experimentation is highly manipulative, it is also often empowering. That these platforms on which, you know, the system is changing in real time as you interact with it, are, for many people, for all of the things that can be said against the digital social media revolution, capable of creating new forms of community, new forms of identity, new forms of voice, new outlets for people's anger, their passion, their complaints, their desire to be heard, new forms of voice. And a democratic political system that is so worried about change that it thinks the only changes it can embrace are the ones that we know are going to work, and yet a system that knew what would work wouldn't need changing, so you're stuck, like American democracy is stuck, like British democracy is stuck. And let's hold on to that, because if we do anything more radical than that, we will collapse back into 1930s authoritarianism. And on the other hand, everything else about our lives, about social rather than political life, is subject to such dramatic, constant experimentation. We shouldn't be so scared of it. I really think that. And I think that rather than trying to fix it, to be willing to try new things is the democratic spirit. Now, I still haven't answered the question, which is how. Then how do you experiment? So the one I've suggested isn't going to happen. We're not going to, I mean, I'd love it if even somewhere someone would give 6-year-olds the vote just to see. And not in a mock primary school election, because that doesn't count. A real vote where real politicians can lose their jobs because the 6-year-olds have turned against them. And I think there are substantive, reasons to make the case, not least because I'm absolutely sure that one of the reasons that British democracy has acquired the character it's had is that we've lived through dramatic social changes, including deep demographic changes. And this system, which 100 years ago was overwhelmingly populated by younger voters, is now predominantly in an elderly or aging society. It's structurally biased in favor of older voters simply because there are more of them. I mean, so I think there is a case for it, but I'm not making the case as a fix. I'm making it as an experiment. But how then do you run experiments in democratic systems, given this inbuilt resistance? So the last thing I'll say, I was asked to talk for half an hour, and I think I've had 25 minutes. Excuse me. The last thing I'll say is that the historic evidence is that, and you'll know the cliche, never let a crisis go to waste. The historic evidence is that democracies are most likely to change, that is, to structurally reform under conditions of not just impasse and partisanship, but actual crisis and stress. That is, where there is a risk of really significant harm for some people, but also of danger. And one of those ways in which democracies change is during war. And many of the big structural institutional changes to British democracy can only be understood because they are products of war. Well, I'm not advocating a war so that we get proportional representation. But there are, I think, 2 big crises coming for British democracy. And you might say they're structural crises. So one is the crisis of the union. There is no question to my mind over the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to see, I can't tell you how it's going to play out, but we are going to see deep tensions and strains around the demand for Scottish independence, the possibility of an independence referendum, maybe a successful independence referendum, but then the knock-on effects that have for questions of governance for England. And the pandemic has, we're through one of, well, not through, we're in the middle of one of these crises, which hasn't quite had this effect, but the pandemic has certainly highlighted many of the inefficiencies and inconsistencies in British democracy, not least the idea that the Westminster government is somehow also the English government, even though it's not an English government. But the strains to the system of devolution under pressure for a Scottish independence referendum, the pressure that then puts on a whole series of knock-on constitutional arrangements. So you could say this provides the opportunity for a fix. This is our chance to get it right. If Scotland becomes independent, maybe that's the point at which England and Wales separately in relation to Northern Ireland, we get this right, we change how Parliament works, we change the electoral system, whatever. Under those conditions, the idea that there would be a fix that people would agree on seems to me absurd. I mean, it's even harder then to agree on anything, but it's a great time to experiment. I mean, under those conditions, we could, there's a lot of opportunity then to think about not what constitutional convention would produce the constitution that would fix British democracy, but what constitutional convention would just be different enough that we don't know what it would do. What form of deliberation, what kind of citizens' assembly would be not predictable, but unpredictable. And the other crisis, it seems to me, of British democracy is climate change, which over the next 10, 20, 30 years is, I think, going to put enormous strain on how we do politics. It's an incredibly difficult problem for democratic systems to resolve. And it is itself going to be subject to, I think, all sorts of partisan divisions. We have a Conservative government that's starting to talk about accelerating carbon neutrality, and there will be deep inbuilt resistance to that. And some of that resistance, I think, is going to produce further crises of British democracy, not least because this may be happening under conditions of climate change, which are themselves extremely, I think, politically and socially demanding. It's going to have economic, social, political consequences. And at some point, I suspect climate change is going to demand forms of structural democratic change. Now, enfranchising children might be one, but it's probably not going to happen. But thinking about the ways in which British democracy could also experiment with alternative forms of decision-making, citizens' assemblies in which citizens do science. Citizen science seems to me an interesting idea. The pandemic has been an example of just how ossified democracy is. So what's been the great democratic experiment of this year, apart from firing Dominic Cummings because the Prime Minister's girlfriend doesn't like him? The other great experiment has been having press conferences where the Prime Minister and scientists talk to us as though we were children. It seems to me there has to be a better way of doing democracy than that. Scientists and non-scientists in a democratic setting, deliberating, discussing, proposing policy, suggesting ways of proceeding. Democratic outside of electoral democracy, something that doesn't happen but could happen. It would be an experiment. We don't know. Who would win the argument, the scientists or the citizens? The great thing is that we maybe don't know. There will be opportunities, I think, for democratic experimentation under the stresses that this system is going to face, crisis stresses, which will not themselves suggest fixes, but will at least produce change. So my feeling about this question is that the wrong way to think about it is that we have to reform democracy in order to open it up. Because I think democracies on the whole do not reform themselves. What we have to do is open it up so that it can be reformed. It's that way around. The opening up has to come first. And if it's opening up, then it has to be open. It can't be opened up in order to achieve a particular reform. But I think it's possible if British democracy was able to embrace alternative models of democracy from deliberative through to more direct. I mean, not necessarily more referendums, but at least possibly more direct forms of democracy. More street democracy, I mean, more protest democracy. I'm all for protest as a form of democratic engagement. That they may then produce the conditions where institutional, structural, maybe even electoral reform is possible. I've often felt if you start with electoral reform, it's really hard to get there. But if you start with something else because you don't know where you're going to end up, it's possible you would end up with electoral reform.
I'm certain that there are people applauding in their living rooms, but unfortunately, the nature of the Zoom meeting is that you can't hear them.
But I was able to see people laughing mockingly at the idea of 6-year-olds voting.
I mostly say I would say I'm intrigued. It certainly would be an experiment.
Exactly.
I can see how
if nothing else, it's a thought experiment.
So from the comments that we've had and the questions that people have put together in their various groups, I'm seeing some themes regarding social media and how the media fuels the combative nature of politics. So I think the way I will put that to you is, I mean, you've spoken about how our politics is ossified and certainly how it is unreformed. And I know in your book, you talk about how the challenges that face a society can so often be answered by their politics if there's the energy to do it. And what I'm interested in is your thoughts on how we energize either our democratic system or the people within it to create more change, because I know that you have argued that perhaps we no longer have the energy in the West to make these changes.
Yeah, one of the themes of that book is that successful democracies, like anything else, get tired. And you know, I use the analogy, it's not just that we are aging societies, but these are aging political systems, and age is not necessarily consistent with energetic change. And then if this is also a question, therefore, about, and it touches on one of the themes I was just alluding to there, you know, there is, as it were, there is so much energy in our politics. You just have to go into an online, almost any online forum, and you don't think, well, this is tired. You know, if anything, you want it to sort of slow down a bit. It often feels fizzing with energy, but there's a real, increasingly, there's a real sense of unease about that, and the idea that democracy needs to be protected from that sort of, as it were, Twitter energy, because it can be very painful and destructive. It can be very unpleasant. It can be not that far away from what sometimes seems like kind of mob forms of politics, that we need to pull up the drawbridge against it. And so we're in that kind of either or world. And I'm often asked this question: has the social media revolution been good or bad for democracy? Mm. And the answer must be that, well, it's both. I mean, it can't be an either or question. It can't be that Facebook is simultaneously fantastic for democracy and terrible for democracy. It empowers, it enriches, it connects, it's allowed communities to form that wouldn't otherwise exist, and it also disempowers, disenfranchises, it concentrates power and wealth in a few hands. These things go together. And it's that kind of either or thing that, if we lower the drawbridge, this stuff will just sort of rush in. And in a way, that's sort of the theme that I have, which I think we've got our risk profile wrong here. So we can sort of, try and hold on to what we've got. And I think the risk is that all of the energy will just go round it. And one of the dangers of democratic politics is not that it's going to fail or collapse or fall back into fascism, but it will become sort of irrelevant. I mean, that so much of the energy, the experimentation, the drama of our lives will go round politics. And we have to find a way for it to go through politics without fearing that it will break it. And I don't think, one wouldn't want to be completely cavalier about this, but more opening up of democratic politics to different forms of voice, including, anger potentially, and, some sort of disdain and contempt of the kind that you see every day on social media, wouldn't break it. It could energize it, but what it wouldn't do is fix it. I don't think there's any sense in which Twitter can fix democracy, but thinking that Twitter might destroy democracy, I think, makes it more rather than less ossified.
I think that is certainly borne out by our organisational experience. The Scottish and Welsh governments' conversations about the nature of democracy are totally different than the Westminster conversations. A newer body, a newer group, totally open to changing the system, changing the votes at 16. Westminster largely settled into its status quo and very difficult to move. So the next question I have is about more traditional media and how we should encourage it to engage with citizens' assemblies. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I don't know how citizens' assemblies are portrayed in the media. I think the last one was the environmental citizens' assembly that I heard large media coverage of.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are two dangers with citizens' assemblies, one of which is they are considered to be boring. And one of the things about electoral democracy, and I have to say particularly first past the post democracy, you just have to look at the United States presidential election. So that's a really, really bad system, and it produces a really, really exciting election, a very unfair system. The one thing I'll say for the Electoral College is it makes it more interesting on election night than if it was just the person with the most votes wins. And it's a competitive world. We're not just competing for energy and experimentation, we're competing for attention. This is an attention economy. And citizens' assemblies are a hard sell. And then there is also the danger that I alluded to, which is they feel to many people like they're kind of over-engineered, that they're, that as it were, if it's a way, say, for quote unquote ordinary representative people to encounter experts, there's a feeling like, well, the experts have set it up because there's it's quite a technical exercise. Whereas, these two problems could at least potentially be solved by trying to convey and having indeed citizens' assemblies, which are inherently unpredictable on really important questions. And, there are examples around the world of citizen assemblies of various kinds being given control over a budget or a choice between different projects, environmental, non-environmental, and surprising people with the outcome. And when the outcome is surprising, it is newsworthy. But for it to be newsworthy, it can't just be a kind of paper exercise. Then the outcome has to be meaningful. But to go back to what I was saying, I think to do it in the spirit of not knowing, but risking, it's a real, here's a sum of money. It will be spent how you say it should be spent. We're not just doing this as an exercise. It's a really hard sell under current conditions, partly because it is sold as a kind of technical fix, and I just think it's not.
I think the next easy to pick out theme I've got from people's thoughts from the various groups we've got is about composition of the Lords and the power of the UK executive. Do you have any strong feelings about the Lords versus the Commons in terms of reform? Because if we're dealing with that sort of unreformed artifice of the British state, do you have any strong feelings about the Lords, or do you think it's the entirety?
Yeah, I mean, so there is another experiment which could be run, which is the classic democratic experiment, which is to deliberately introduce more randomness into politics. So, as it were, selection by lot, the original form of democracy. Ancient Athenian democracy was many things, but it wasn't an electoral democracy. It was, it was a mixture of direct and random. And there have been over the years. Again, I think like votes for children, it's probably not going to happen. But proposals to have a second chamber, which was representative in that other sense, that people were. So in my ideal dream world, my fix for democracy, and this could either be House of Lords or Commons or both, would be to, on the ballot paper, to have a none of the above box. And if you tick the none of the above box and none of the above wins the plurality, everyone who ticked it then gets put into a big bag, and one of those people is pulled out and becomes the representative. And then if you ran that over 2 or 3 cycles, I think it would be very, very interesting to see. I imagine first time round, none of the above would win in a lot of places. And then one of those voters would be the MP or the member of the Lords. And then after a cycle, then there'd be an opportunity to decide whether that worked better and so on. That seems to me like, again, it's never going to happen, but that kind of, rather than the more specific technical fixes to the Lords, which we've seen, there are 2 things about it. One, it's just really, really hard to get agreement. It's a bit like what we saw around Brexit. The system that is capable of reforming itself does not need, on the whole, that kind of reform. It's not quite as simple as that, but I would say 200 years of British and American political democratic history have suggested that that is a genuine problem. The French don't have that problem because they've had 5 republics. So if you want to have 5 republics, you at least have 5 goes. But if you have a relatively stable system, self-reform at the institutional level is incredibly hard. Randomization, which has the advantage of being both surprising and a fundamentally democratic principle, if you can somehow inveigle it in, would be good.
I have to say, we have had conversations in the past about none of the above, never with the added jeopardy of becoming an MP unintentionally. I think that is fascinating. Unfortunately, we are running.
So that is my fix. In fact, I've committed to it. That's
okay. There we go. We are running very short of time, and I'm supposed to end relatively on time. So I think the last question that I'm going to pick out from our panels would be about the influence of money and disproportionate funding for various political parties. Do you have any strong views on the role of money within UK politics? Because obviously that is a place where we do differ from the American system.
Yeah, and again, that's where, it seems to me that some of these questions, there is an interesting comparison to be made. American politics looks to me inherently harder to reform. That sort of, in America, constitutional reform is hard because the Constitution was set up to be hard to reform. But the system that was capable of reforming its own Constitution, it seems to me it's a classic example, wouldn't need it. The American system is gerrymandered. Most right-thinking people know it needs to be less gerrymandered. Trouble is, it's so gerrymandered, it's really hard to un-gerrymander it. And same with money in American politics. There's so much of it that it's really hard to get it out. I think we're better off than that. I think we have a political system which is much more amenable to, relatively speaking, independent outside bodies with some authority and legitimacy regulating what we do. It is not a free-for-all in that sense. I'm not personally, I'm not personally sure that the role of money in politics is the #1 problem. It is an unequal playing field. I think the ways in which political parties are funded is, I think the word for it would be problematic. I don't think it's deeply corrupt. I think, relatively speaking, British democracy, relatively speaking, in historic and geographic, global terms, not absolutely, but relatively, British democracy is uncorrupt. I mean, it's not without corruption, but it is uncorrupt. But I certainly think that the dangers as we move forward are great. As we move into the 21st century, as we move into potentially, and this would include a potentially more experimental form of democracy, there is always the danger, not that it's a fix, but that it opens itself up, particularly using new technology, to forms of influence and indeed sort of monetary buyout that we're not aware of. I think we need to be wary of it. I don't personally, if I was asked to list the order of things that needed sorting, I'm not sure the funding of political parties would be my number one, but that's not to say that it's not, I definitely don't think it's perfect. And that's a bit of a fudging answer, but I wouldn't want to make it sound like I think that we face the same structural issues as American democracy does at the moment. I think there are grounds for thinking that British democracy is more reformable, but the other thing you always have to do is decide on your priorities. And one of the reasons I think institutional reform is so hard is there are always so many things we could do.
Yes, I think one of the things that typifies us as a society is we tend to be people that have identified the system as the route to reform a plethora of other issues, as opposed to others who we often meet who care about the environment or money in politics, but haven't got to the point where they see the system as the route to reform.
And I know we're about to finish, but to say one thing, I thought what you said was really interesting, which is, as it were, the new forms of British democracy, the devolved assemblies, are more open. There is a connection between newness and openness. There is something to be said for newness for its own sake. You don't know what it will lead to, but at least it's new. And in a sense, that was the message I was trying to convey, that sometimes that's the way to think about it. Newness leads to openness rather than openness leading to newness.
Yes, the question is how to get Westminster to be new.
Maybe,
well, maybe a building move is more important than I thought.
Yeah, could be.
Anyway, thank you ever so much for making time for us. I'm afraid we are out of time. I do have a number of other questions, but I cannot go on all day. Thank you, Professor David Runciman, for making time to address us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. See you soon, I hope.